What the hell do you think you're doing here? Get out! We don't serve your kind in this establishment. How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? Every single head in the Michelin-starred dining room of Aria, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, swiveled in unison. All eyes, a mix of shock, disdain, and morbid curiosity, landed on the impossibly poised blonde woman whose fury was anything but. She towered over a table where a young black woman sat alone, her simple emerald dress a stark contrast to the sea of designer labels. Victoria Sterling's perfectly manicured finger, adorned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg, pointed accusingly, her voice a weapon dripping with generations of unchecked entitlement. I will not be insulted by some cheap, classless nobody who obviously snuck in off the street. Her hand, a blur of white skin and glittering jewels, flew through the air with vicious speed. Slap! Whoosh! The sound was obscene in the opulent silence, echoing like a gunshot through the cathedral-like space. Diners gasped. A wine glass shattered somewhere in the back. Several patrons, their initial shock giving way to the modern instinct to document, fumbled for their phones. "Who is she?" someone whispered from a nearby table. "Probably lost or something." A few nervous, cruel titters rippled through the gallery of the wealthy and powerful, but Amara Vance didn't even flinch. In that single, crystalline moment of impact, Victoria Sterling had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of her life. A mistake that would systematically dismantle her entire world in the next 60 seconds. If you're already hooked on this story, do me a huge favor and smash that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to you, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single one. Did you just put your hands on my wife? My wife. Now, let's continue. The late afternoon sun of November 12th, 2024, poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Central Park West penthouse, casting long, golden fingers across the polished marble floors of the master suite. Amara Vance stood before her walk-in closet, a space larger than her entire childhood apartment, running her fingers along the soft fabric of a simple emerald green dress. At 29, she possessed a quiet, profound beauty that needed no artificial enhancement. Her warm brown skin seemed to glow from within, a canvas for expressive dark eyes, framed by naturally long lashes, and a gentle smile that had first captivated her husband's heart 3 years ago. "This one feels right," she murmured to herself, pulling the modest knee-length dress from its velvet hanger. The fabric was quality silk, well-tailored but utterly unpretentious, exactly the kind of clothing that made her feel most like herself. From the adjoining master bath came the sound of running water as Julian Croft finished his shower. At 38, Julian commanded attention without ever demanding it. He was a man of contrasts, 6'2" of confident presence, with a sharp, almost startling intelligence in his kind green eyes that had built a global tech empire, Orion Dynamics, worth well over $5 billion. His company had revolutionized data security. But at this moment, his mind was focused entirely on the evening ahead, a rare date night carved out of their impossibly busy schedules. "Amara, darling, are you ready?" Julian's voice, a warm baritone with the faint trace of a Boston accent that only emerged when he was truly relaxed, carried from the bathroom. "Our reservation at Aria is for 8 chum." Amara glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. 7:15 p.m. She slipped into the emerald dress, appreciating how the fabric moved with her body, a second skin of comfort and quiet elegance. As she fastened the simple gold locket Julian had given her for their second anniversary, she caught her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed caught between two worlds. The girl who had grown up on the south side of Chicago, and the wife of one of America's wealthiest and most influential men. Julian emerged from the bathroom, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal gray suit. He looked every inch the successful tycoon, from his perfectly styled dark hair to his polished Italian leather shoes. When his eyes landed on Amara, his expression softened, a familiar mixture of profound love and gentle concern creasing the corners of his eyes. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice a low hum as he crossed the room to where she stood. His hands found her waist, pulling her close until she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "You always do." Amara heard the unspoken "but" in his tone. They had had this conversation before, always gently, always with love, but it lingered between them like the morning fog over Central Park. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly, her fingers finding his tie and straightening it, even though it was already perfect. "You want me to wear the Dior gown?" Julian's thumb traced a line along her jaw. "I want you to wear whatever makes you happy, Amara. It's just—" He paused, choosing his words with the same care he used when negotiating a billion-dollar merger. Aria attracts a certain crowd. People in that world. They judge first and ask questions never. I don't want anyone to treat you poorly because they don't understand who you are. Amara's heart did a familiar, painful clench. This was the eternal struggle of their marriage. Julian's fierce, protective instincts warring with her desperate need to remain true to the woman she had always been. She understood his concern. In their world of charity galas, international business dinners, and high society events, appearance often mattered more than substance. But the thought of transforming herself into a mannequin for designer labels, someone unrecognizable even to herself, felt like a betrayal of the very woman he'd fallen in love with. "I'll change," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. But as she moved toward the closet, Julian caught her hand, his grip firm but tender. "No." His voice was resolute. "I fell in love with the woman who wore a $20 dress to our first coffee date and made it look like haute couture. I fell in love with her mind, her heart, her passion. Don't you ever change for anyone, Amara, not even for me." The memory brought a genuine smile to both their faces. That crisp autumn day 3 years ago, when they'd met at a small, unassuming cafe in Greenwich Village, seemed like a lifetime ago. Amara had been working as a community outreach coordinator for an inner-city literacy program, barely scraping by on her nonprofit salary, but immeasurably rich in purpose. Julian, taking a rare, unscheduled break from his demanding life, had been immediately captivated by her passionate, articulate argument with the barista about educational inequality. "Are you sure?" Amara asked now, searching his face for any hint of doubt. "I'm sure," Julian said, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "You are perfect, exactly as you are." 20 minutes later, they were seated in Julian's midnight blue Bentley, gliding through the glittering canyon-like streets of Manhattan. The November evening was brisk, the city lights painting the sky in a kaleidoscope of electric colors. Amara watched the elegant shops and world-renowned restaurants pass by, each more exclusive and intimidating than the last. "Nervous?" Julian asked, his hand finding hers on the plush leather seat between them. "A little," she admitted. "I always feel like I'm wearing a costume in places like this, even when I'm wearing my own clothes." Julian brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You belong everywhere I belong, Amara. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." His words were meant to comfort, but Amara couldn't shake the premonition that tonight would test that belief more than ever before. As they pulled up to Aria, with its understated bronze plaque and reputation as a sanctuary for the city's elite, she took a deep breath and prepared to enter a world that still felt profoundly foreign, even after 3 years of marriage. The valet opened her door with practiced, almost invisible efficiency, and Amara stepped onto the sidewalk in her comfortable flats and simple dress. Around them, other patrons were arriving in a parade of luxury vehicles. The women were draped in designer gowns and glittering jewelry that caught the restaurant's warm, inviting light. Mr. and Mrs. Croft? The maitre d' greeted them with a warm, genuine smile as they entered. Your usual table is ready. The dining room buzzed with the low murmur of expensive conversations and the gentle clink of fine crystal and silver. Amara followed Julian to their secluded corner table, acutely aware of the subtle glances from other diners. Some looked curious, others were openly dismissive. She had learned to read these expressions over the years, the way people's eyes would slide over her simple appearance, register her as insignificant, before focusing entirely on the unmistakable power and presence of her husband. Relax, Julian whispered, as they settled into their seats. You are the most beautiful woman in this room, and more importantly, you are the kindest. Before Amara could respond, Julian's phone buzzed with an urgent, insistent vibration. He glanced at the screen, and a deep frown creased his brow. It's the Singapore office, he said, his voice laced with apology. The Kanjiro deal. There's been a complication. I have to take this. Amara nodded with a practiced understanding. Even on their precious date nights, Julian's responsibilities as the CEO of a global corporation sometimes intruded. Go ahead, I'll be fine. 5 minutes, I promise, Julian said, standing and kissing the top of her head before striding toward the restaurant's quieter bar area to take his call. Left alone, Amara sipped her water and observed the elegant scene around her. The soft, ambient lighting cast everything in a warm, flattering glow, and the quiet conversations created an atmosphere of refined intimacy. She was just beginning to relax when she noticed a woman at a nearby table staring at her with undisguised, venomous hostility. The woman was perhaps in her late 40s, with professionally styled blonde hair and the kind of sharp-featured, ageless beauty that suggested extensive cosmetic enhancement. She wore a white designer dress that probably cost more than Amara's first car, and her jewelry caught the light with every disapproving gesture she made to her dinner companions. What do you think you're looking at? The thought formed in Amara's mind, but she quickly pushed it away. She was being paranoid. The woman was probably looking at something else entirely. But as the minutes ticked by and Julian's 5-minute call stretched into 10, then 15, Amara became increasingly aware of the woman's unblinking attention. Finally, to Amara's horror, she saw the blonde woman excuse herself from her table and begin walking directly, purposefully, toward her. Amara's heart rate quickened. Something in the woman's expression, a toxic cocktail of disgust and self-righteous anger, made her stomach tighten with a familiar, sickening dread. She had seen that look before growing up in Chicago, and it never, ever led anywhere good. The woman was now standing beside Amara's table, her cold blue eyes scanning Amara from head to toe with an obvious theatrical disdain. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the practiced, condescending authority of someone who had never been told no in her life. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with a false, saccharine politeness that was more insulting than any overt slur. "But I think there's been some kind of mistake." Amara looked up at the woman standing beside her table, her heart already beginning to race with an instinct she'd hoped she'd never have to feel again. The blonde woman's presence radiated hostility like heat from asphalt on a summer day, and Amara could smell her expensive, cloying perfume mixed with something sharper, the acrid scent of prejudice and entitlement. "I'm sorry," Amara said softly, her voice remarkably steady, despite the warning bells clanging in her mind. "What kind of mistake?" The woman's perfectly glossed lips curved into a smile that was utterly devoid of warmth. She was tall, perhaps 5'8" in her designer heels, with a kind of artificially perfect appearance that spoke of personal trainers, weekly salon appointments, and a surgeon's careful hand. Her white Balenciaga dress probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in 6 months, and the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the restaurant's ambient lighting like captured stars. "Well," the woman said, her voice pitched just loud enough that nearby tables began to turn their attention toward the conversation. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone, and I thought perhaps you were lost." Around them, the gentle hum of dinner conversation began to quiet, as other patrons sensed the brewing drama. Amara was acutely aware of the eyes turning in their direction, the way conversations paused mid-sentence as people strained to listen. The warmth she'd felt moments earlier was rapidly being replaced by a cold, hard knot of dread in her stomach. "I'm not lost," Amara replied calmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "I'm having dinner with my husband." The woman's laugh was sharp and brittle, like the sound of breaking crystal. "Your husband?" She glanced around theatrically, a performer playing to an audience, making sure she had the full attention of the surrounding tables. "I don't see anyone with you, dear. And frankly, I'm having trouble understanding how someone like you could possibly afford to eat at a place like Aria." The words hit Amara like physical blows. Someone like you. The phrase contained multitudes of assumption and hatred, all wrapped in the deceptively polite language of Manhattan's high society. Amara had encountered this before. The insidious assumption that her skin color automatically disqualified her from certain spaces, certain levels of success, certain types of respect. "My husband stepped away to take a business call," Amara said, her voice remaining level despite the fury that was beginning to build in her chest. "He'll be back shortly." "Oh, how convenient," the woman said, her voice dripping with corrosive sarcasm. "A mysterious husband who's conveniently absent." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that still carried to the rapt nearby tables. "Listen, sweetheart. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this establishment has standards. People like you don't just wander in here and sit down at premium tables." Amara felt a hot flush of shame and anger flood her cheeks. The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Every eye in their section of the restaurant was now focused on their exchange, and Amara could see the mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and, unfortunately, agreement on some of the watching faces. "I have every right to be here," Amara said, her voice growing firmer. "Just like anyone else." The woman's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Rights? Oh, honey, let me explain something to you about rights." She gestured grandly around the elegant, hushed dining room. "This isn't some chain restaurant where anyone with $20 can walk in. This is Aria. Do you have any idea what it costs to eat here? Do you know who comes here?" Amara's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She thought of Julian's words in the car. "You belong everywhere I belong." But sitting here now, facing this woman's venom while her husband was absent, those words felt as fragile as spun glass. "I know exactly where I am," Amara said quietly, "and I know I have every right to be here." "Rights don't pay for $400 tasting menus," the woman snapped, her thin veneer of politeness finally cracking completely. "And they certainly don't make you belong in places like this. Look at yourself." Her eyes raked over Amara's simple emerald dress with undisguised contempt. "That dress probably came from a department store. Those shoes look like something from, well, I wouldn't know. You are completely and utterly out of your league here." The sheer cruelty in the woman's voice was breathtaking. Amara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "My clothes don't determine my worth," Amara said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "And they certainly don't give you the right to judge me." "Worth?" The woman laughed again, the sound like breaking bones. "Let me tell you about worth, dear. I am Victoria Sterling. My husband is the CEO of Sterling Capital. We donate more to the Met in a single year than you'll probably make in a decade. I know everyone who matters in this city, and I can guarantee you that none of them would appreciate having their evening disrupted by someone who clearly doesn't understand proper social boundaries." Victoria Sterling. The name meant nothing to Amara, but the way Victoria pronounced it suggested it should command immediate respect and deference. Around them, Amara could hear whispered conversations as other diners tried to figure out what was happening. "I'm not disrupting anyone's evening," Amara said, her voice a low, steady thrum. "I'm simply having dinner." "No," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly. "You're making everyone uncomfortable. Look around you. Do you see anyone else dressed like they're going to a PTA meeting? Do you see anyone else who looks like they belong here as little as you do?" The words were carefully chosen daggers, each one designed to wound. Amara felt her confidence crumbling under the sustained assault, felt herself shrinking back into the scared little girl she'd been growing up in Chicago, the one who'd learned early that there were places she wasn't welcome, simply because of the color of her skin. "I think you should leave," Victoria continued, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone accustomed to having her commands obeyed without question. "Before you embarrass yourself any further. This isn't the kind of place where you can just walk in and pretend to be something you're not." "I'm not pretending to be anything," Amara said, but her voice was weaker now, shaken by the sustained attack on her dignity. "Oh, please," Victoria said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "We both know what this is. You saw an opportunity to sneak into a fancy restaurant, probably hoping to catch the attention of some wealthy man who might be impressed by your little charade. Well, let me save you the trouble. It's not working. Everyone here can see exactly what you are." The words hit Amara like acid. The implication that she was some kind of gold digger, someone trying to trick her way into wealth and status, was so far from the truth it was almost absurd. But the way Victoria said it, with such unshakable conviction and authority, made Amara question everything about herself. "You don't know anything about me," Amara whispered. "I know enough," Victoria replied coldly. "I know you don't belong here. I know you're making everyone uncomfortable with your presence. And I know that the longer you sit there, pretending to be something you're not, the more pathetic you look." Victoria leaned closer then, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only Amara could hear. "Let me make this simple for you. Leave now, quietly, and maybe you can salvage what's left of your dignity. Keep sitting there, and I will make sure everyone in this restaurant knows exactly what kind of trash you really are." The threat hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Amara felt trapped, cornered by a predator who seemed to take genuine pleasure in her discomfort. Every instinct screamed at her to stand up and walk away, to escape this nightmare before it got worse. But something deeper, something stronger, kept her seated. Maybe it was the memory of Julian's words about belonging everywhere he belonged. Maybe it was the thought of all the times she had been forced to back down, to make herself smaller, to accept less than she deserved. Or maybe it was simply the unshakable knowledge that she had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve this vicious, unprovoked treatment. "I'm not leaving," Amara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have every right to be here, and I'm not going anywhere." Victoria's face flushed a deep, ugly red with rage, The rejection of her authority, the refusal to be cowed, seemed to trigger something primal and violent within her. For a moment, Amara thought the woman might simply storm away in a huff, but instead, Victoria's voice rose to a level that ensured everyone in the restaurant could hear her next words. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Victoria shrieked, all pretense of composure gone. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will not be insulted by some nobody who doesn't even belong in the same zip code as this restaurant." And then, before Amara could react, before anyone could intervene, Victoria's hand flew through the air with vicious speed and connected with Amara's cheek in a slap that echoed through the now utterly silent dining room like a gunshot. The sound seemed to freeze time itself, and in that crystalline moment of impact, Victoria Sterling had just made the biggest, most irreversible mistake of her life. The silence that followed the slap was absolute and deafening. For a heartbeat, the entire dining room of Aria seemed suspended in time, as if the very air had crystallized around the moment of impact. Amara's cheek burned with a fire that seemed to spread through her entire body. The sting of Victoria's hand, nothing compared to the deeper, searing wound of public humiliation. Amara's right hand instinctively rose to touch her cheek, her fingers trembling as they encountered the heat radiating from where Victoria's palm had connected. The sensation was surreal, almost dreamlike in its intensity. She could taste the faint, metallic tang of copper in her mouth, where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip, and her left ear rang with a high-pitched whine that made the world sound muffled and distant. Around them, the restaurant had transformed into a theater of shocked faces and whispered gasps. Forks remained suspended halfway to mouths. Wine glasses were held frozen in mid-sip. Conversations had died so completely that the soft classical music playing through the sound system suddenly seemed thunderously loud. Every single eye in the dining room was fixed on their table. Some faces showed horror. Others displayed the kind of morbid fascination people feel when witnessing a car crash. Victoria Sterling stood over Amara like a conquering general, her chest heaving with righteous indignation, and her blue eyes blazing with a strange, triumphant satisfaction. Her perfectly manicured hand was still slightly raised from the blow, and there was something almost feral in her expression, as if the act of violence had unleashed something primitive and savage within her. "There," Victoria said, her voice carrying with perfect clarity across the silent dining room. "Maybe now you'll understand that actions have consequences. You can't just waltz into places where you don't belong and expect to be treated like you matter." Amara felt tears building behind her eyes, a hot, shameful tide, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of this monstrous woman and all these staring faces. The humiliation was overwhelming, a crushing weight that seemed to press down on her from all sides. Part of her wanted to run, to flee this nightmare and never look back. But a deeper part, the part that had survived growing up poor on the south side of Chicago, the part that had worked 3 jobs to put herself through college, that part refused to give Victoria the satisfaction. "You hit me," Amara said, her voice barely a whisper, but it somehow carried with perfect clarity in the absolute silence of the restaurant. The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, as if speaking them made the assault real in a way that the physical sensation hadn't. "I defended myself," Victoria replied coldly, smoothing down her white Balenciaga dress as if the act of violence had somehow disheveled her perfectly maintained appearance. "You were being aggressive and threatening. Everyone here witnessed it." The lie was so blatant, so completely divorced from reality, that Amara felt a new kind of shock wash over her. Victoria was actually rewriting history in real time, attempting to transform herself from aggressor to victim, even as Amara's cheek continued to throb with a dull, burning pain. I never threatened you, Amara said, her voice growing stronger despite the tears that threatened to spill over. I was sitting at my table. You approached me. You attacked me. Oh, please, Victoria scoffed, turning to address the watching crowd as if they were a jury she needed to convince. Did anyone else see how hostile she became when I simply tried to have a polite, quiet conversation? The way she raised her voice and became aggressive? A few of the nearby diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Victoria and Amara. Amara could see the cold calculations happening behind their eyes, the way they were weighing social status and appearances against the simple truth. Victoria's expensive clothes, her confident demeanor, her obvious wealth and social connections, all of it carried weight in this world, a weight that Amara's simple dress and quiet dignity simply couldn't match. She was perfectly polite, said a firm, clear voice from a table near the window. An elderly man with kind eyes and a full head of silver hair had spoken up, his voice cutting through Victoria's attempted narrative like a surgeon's scalpel. I saw the whole thing. This young lady never raised her voice or acted aggressively. You, madam, were the one who approached her table uninvited and initiated the hostility. Victoria's face flushed a deep, ugly red with anger at this public contradiction to her story. I don't know what you think you saw, but this woman was clearly out of line. She doesn't belong here, and everyone knows it. What I know, the elderly man replied, his voice unwavering, is that I just watched you assault someone for no reason other than your own prejudice. Other diners began to murmur among themselves, the spell of shocked silence finally breaking. Amara could hear fragments of conversation floating around her. Did she really just hit her? Over what? I couldn't hear what they were saying. That poor girl. She looks terrified. Victoria Sterling always was a piece of work. The last comment made Victoria whip her head around, her eyes scanning the room to identify who had spoken. I'll have you know that my family has been a cornerstone of this community for generations, she announced loudly, her voice trembling with rage. We don't need lectures about proper behavior from people who clearly don't understand the social dynamics at play here. Amara slowly rose from her chair, her legs shaky, but her resolve hardening like steel. The movement drew every eye back to her, and she could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force. Her cheek still burned, and she was certain there would be a mark. But something inside her had shifted. The scared little girl from Chicago was gone, replaced by a woman who had survived too much to be broken by Victoria Sterling's cruelty. Social dynamics, Amara repeated, her voice clear and strong. Is that what you call racism and assault? The word racism seemed to electrify the room. Several diners gasped audibly, and Victoria's face went from flushed red to a pale, chalky white in an instant. How dare you? Victoria hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. How dare you play the race card when you're the one who doesn't belong here? This has nothing to do with race and everything to do with class and proper behavior. You told me people like me don't belong here, Amara said, her voice growing stronger with each word. You judged me based on my appearance and decided I wasn't worthy of basic human respect. You attacked me because you thought I was powerless to fight back. What would you call that? I would call it reality, Victoria snapped back, regaining some of her earlier bravado. Some people understand their place in the world, and some people need to be reminded of it. You clearly fall into the second category. The cruelty in Victoria's words was breathtaking. Even some of the diners who had initially seemed sympathetic to Victoria's position were now looking uncomfortable with her continued aggression. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier was shaking his head slowly in disgust. Where is the manager? Victoria suddenly demanded, turning away from Amara to scan the restaurant. I want this woman removed immediately. She's creating a disturbance and making threats. As if summoned by her words, A nervous-looking man in a perfectly pressed suit appeared at their table. He was clearly the restaurant manager, his face pale with the horror of having a public scene unfold in his prestigious establishment. His eyes darted between Victoria and Amara, clearly trying to assess the situation and determine the path of least resistance. "Mrs. Sterling," he said carefully, his voice a low, placating murmur. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately in my office." "There's nothing to discuss privately," Victoria replied imperiously. "This woman doesn't belong here, and I want her removed. Now." The manager's eyes flicked to Amara, taking in her simple dress, her obvious distress, and the angry red mark on her cheek that was already beginning to darken. "Ma'am," he said gently, addressing Amara, "perhaps I could arrange for you to be seated in a different section of the restaurant." The suggestion felt like a knife twisting in Amara's heart. Even the manager, faced with clear evidence of assault, was ready to move her rather than confront Victoria. The injustice of it made her feel sick to her stomach. "I'm not moving," Amara said firmly. "I was assaulted while sitting peacefully at my table. I haven't done anything wrong." "She's being dramatic," Victoria interjected, her voice dripping with disdain. "I barely touched her, and I only did so because she was becoming aggressive and making me feel threatened." "The mark on her face suggests otherwise," the elderly man called out from his table. "And I'd be happy to testify to that fact if necessary." Victoria whirled around to face him again, her face a mask of fury. "No one asked for your opinion, old man. This is between me and this woman who thinks she can con her way into places she doesn't belong." "Con?" Amara repeated, the word hitting her like another slap. "What exactly do you think I'm trying to con?" "Please," Victoria said with a dismissive, ugly laugh. "The mysterious husband who's conveniently absent. The sob story about belonging here. We all know what this is. You're probably hoping to seduce some wealthy man. Or maybe you're planning to sue the restaurant for some imagined slight. Either way, your little scheme isn't going to work." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that Amara felt her anger finally override her shock and pain. This woman had not only physically assaulted her, but was now attacking her character and integrity in front of a room full of strangers. "You don't know anything about me," Amara said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. "You made assumptions based on prejudice and ignorance, and when I didn't submit to your bullying, you resorted to violence. That says everything about your character and nothing about mine." Victoria's face contorted with rage. "Character? Don't lecture me about character when you're sitting here playing dress-up in a restaurant you could never afford, spinning lies about husbands who don't exist." It was at that exact moment, as Victoria's voice reached its peak of vicious triumph, that the soft murmur of the crowd suddenly stopped entirely. Amara saw Victoria's eyes widen slightly as she registered something behind Amara, and when Amara turned to see what had captured everyone's attention, her heart nearly stopped. Julian was walking towards their table. His face was a mask of controlled fury that Amara had never seen before. His green eyes were locked on Victoria with an intensity that made several nearby diners instinctively lean away from his path. Every step he took seemed to charge the air with electricity, and Amara could practically feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Victoria, however, seemed to interpret his approach differently. A smile of vindication spread across her face as she assumed he was the manager or owner coming to support her position. "Thank God," Victoria said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Finally, someone with some authority. Sir, please tell this woman that she needs to leave immediately. She's been causing nothing but trouble since she arrived." Julian stopped directly beside Amara, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face for a single second. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried such a weight of menace that it seemed to echo off the walls. "Did you just put your hands on my wife?" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stunned silence of Arya with devastating clarity. Victoria Sterling's triumphant smile froze on her face, then slowly melted away as the meaning of Julian's words penetrated her consciousness. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish suddenly yanked from water, while her eyes darted between Julian's imposing figure and Amara's tear-stained face. Your wife?" Victoria stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her expertly applied makeup stood out like war paint against suddenly pale skin. Julian stepped closer to Amara, his hand moving to rest protectively on her shoulder. The gesture was gentle when directed toward his wife, but his eyes remained fixed on Victoria with the cold, unblinking intensity of a predator studying its prey. At 6'2", and radiating a barely contained fury, he seemed to fill the entire space around their table. "My wife," Julian repeated, his voice gaining volume and steel with each syllable. "Amara Vance Croft, the woman you just assaulted in front of a room full of witnesses." The collective gasp from the surrounding diners was audible. Heads turned and whispers exploded like popcorn as the magnitude of Victoria's mistake began to register throughout the restaurant. Several people pulled out their phones, some clearly Googling Julian's name, while others appeared to be texting frantically. "Julian Croft," someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Oh my God, that's Julian Croft from Orion Dynamics, the tech billionaire. She hit a billionaire's wife." Victoria's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. The blood had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking almost ghostly under the warm restaurant lighting. Her perfectly manicured hand trembled as she pressed it to her throat. I didn't know," Victoria whispered, then immediately seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, she didn't look like..." "Like what?" Julian's voice cut through her stammering like a blade. He moved slightly, positioning himself more fully between Victoria and Amara, his body language screaming protection and barely restrained violence. "She didn't look like she deserved basic human respect? She didn't look like she belonged in the same space as you?" Every word Julian spoke seemed to land on Victoria like a physical blow. She flinched with each question, her eyes darting around the restaurant as if looking for an escape route. But there was nowhere to run. Every table, every face, every pair of eyes was focused entirely on their confrontation. The restaurant manager, who had been frozen in horror since Julian's arrival, suddenly sprang into action. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I am so terribly sorry. If I had known Mrs. Croft was your wife, this never would have..." "If you had known?" Julian turned his attention to the manager, and the man actually took a step backward. "Are you suggesting that my wife deserved to be treated this way because you didn't recognize her? That assault is acceptable as long as the victim isn't wealthy enough?" "No, sir, absolutely not," the manager said quickly, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. "I meant no disrespect. We have the highest regard for all our guests." "Clearly not all your guests," Julian said coldly, his hand moving to gently touch the red mark on Amara's cheek. The tender gesture, so at odds with the fury radiating from every other part of his body, made several women in the dining room gasp audibly. Victoria seemed to find her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. "I had no idea who she was. She was dressed so casually. How was I supposed to know?" The words were perhaps the worst thing she could have said. Julian's eyes, which had been cold before, now turned absolutely arctic. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people at nearby tables had to strain to hear him. But the menace in his tone was unmistakable. So, you admit that you judged my wife based on her appearance. You decided that because she wasn't wearing expensive enough clothes, she didn't deserve respect. You thought that because she chose to dress modestly, she was somehow less worthy of basic human dignity. That's not what I meant, Victoria said desperately, but her voice lacked any conviction. Everyone in the restaurant could see the truth written across her face. Then what did you mean? Julian asked, his voice still dangerously quiet. Explain to me, Mrs. Sterling, exactly what gave you the right to approach my wife, berate her, humiliate her in public, and then put your hands on her. The use of her name seemed to shock Victoria even further. She clearly hadn't expected Julian to know who she was, and the realization that he did seemed to add another layer of terror to her already overwhelming panic. We've never been introduced, Victoria said weakly. How do you know my name? I make it my business to know everyone who matters in this city, Julian replied, his voice flat and cold. And more importantly, I make it my business to know everyone who might pose a threat to my family. Your husband, Edward Sterling, is the CEO of Sterling Capital. Your family has significant investments in several businesses throughout the city. You sit on the board of 3 different charities and consider yourself a pillar of this community. Each fact Julian recited seemed to drain more color from Victoria's face. The realization that he knew exactly who she was, that this wasn't some random encounter with a stranger, was clearly terrifying her. You also, Julian continued, his voice growing harder, have a reputation for exactly this kind of behavior. This isn't the first time you've used your perceived social status to bully people you consider beneath you, but it is going to be the last. The threat was unmistakable, and Victoria seemed to shrink physically under the weight of it. Around them, the restaurant had become completely silent except for the soft, classical music still playing through the sound system, creating a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Please, Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I didn't mean— You didn't mean to get caught, Julian corrected her. You didn't mean to discover that your victim had the power to fight back, but you absolutely meant to humiliate and degrade someone you thought was powerless. Amara watched this exchange with a mixture of awe and concern. She had never seen her husband like this before, had never witnessed the full force of his power and authority directed at another human being. It was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying to see how completely he could dominate a situation when protecting someone he loved. Julian, Amara said softly, placing her hand on his arm. She could feel the tension in his muscles, could sense how close he was to completely losing control. Maybe we should— No, Julian said firmly, but his voice gentled slightly when he looked at her. You were assaulted, sweetheart, in public, by someone who thought you couldn't fight back. That's not something we're going to quietly ignore. He turned his attention back to Victoria, who was now openly crying, her perfect makeup running in black streaks down her cheeks. Mrs. Sterling, you have exactly one opportunity to explain yourself. Why did you think it was acceptable to put your hands on my wife? Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She didn't look like she belonged here. I assumed— You assumed that gave you the right to assault her, Julian finished coldly. I barely touched her, Victoria said desperately, but even as the words left her mouth, she seemed to realize how pathetic they sounded. The mark on her face suggests otherwise, said the elderly man who had spoken up earlier. His voice carried clearly across the silent restaurant. And I'd be happy to testify to exactly what I witnessed if legal action is pursued. The mention of legal action seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. She swayed on her feet, gripping the chair even tighter to keep from falling. Legal action? She whispered. You can't— Surely we can work this out privately, between civilized people. Civilized people don't assault others in restaurants, Julian replied, his voice dripping with ice. Civilized people don't judge others based on their clothing or skin color. Civilized people don't assume that wealth gives them the right to treat others as less than human. The dining room remained a frozen tableau, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Cell phones were now openly recording, and Amara realized that within hours, this entire scene would likely be all over social media. The thought should have horrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Let the world see what Victoria Sterling really was. What would you do if you witnessed someone being treated this way? Have you ever stood up to a bully? Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to like this video if you believe everyone deserves respect, regardless of how they're dressed. Please, Victoria begged, her voice now completely broken. My husband, my family, if this gets out. You should have thought about your family before you decided to assault mine, Julian replied, without a shred of mercy. The confrontation was far from over, and Victoria Sterling was about to discover that some mistakes carry consequences that money and social status cannot undo. Julian's mention of consequences seemed to trigger something desperate and primal in Victoria Sterling. Her tears were flowing freely now, creating dark rivers of mascara down her cheeks as she clutched the chair back with white-knuckled hands. The transformation from entitled socialite to terrified woman was so complete that several diners were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to feel satisfaction or pity. You don't understand, Victoria said, her voice cracking with desperation. This will destroy everything my family has worked for. My husband's business, his relationships, our standing in the community, our children's futures. Please, there has to be another way to handle this. Julian's expression remained as unmovable as carved granite. The same way you considered my wife's feelings when you decided to humiliate her, the same way you thought about consequences when you raised your hand to strike her. As Victoria continued to plead, Amara found herself studying her husband's face. She had seen Julian negotiate billion-dollar deals, had watched him command boardrooms full of powerful executives with quiet confidence. But this was different. This was personal in a way that business never could be. The protective fury radiating from him was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Amara, Julian said softly, never taking his eyes off Victoria. I want you to tell everyone here exactly what happened from the beginning. Amara took a shaky breath, her hand instinctively moving to touch the tender spot on her cheek where Victoria's slap had landed. The pain had dulled to a constant throb, but the humiliation still burned fresh and raw. I was sitting at our table, waiting for Julian to finish his phone call, Amara began, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry throughout the silent restaurant. Mrs. Sterling approached me and said there had been some kind of mistake. She told me I was lost, that people like me don't belong in places like this. Several diners nodded, remembering the beginning of the confrontation they had witnessed. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier was listening intently, his face grave with disapproval. She said I couldn't afford to eat here, Amara continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She mocked my clothes, called them cheap. She said I was playing some kind of game, pretending to be something I wasn't. When I told her I was waiting for my husband, she laughed and said he was a convenient fiction. Victoria's face crumpled further with each word Amara spoke. I didn't mean it that way, she whispered, but her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. Then she told me I was trying to con someone, Amara said, her eyes meeting Victoria's directly for the first time since Julian's arrival. She said I was either looking for a wealthy man to seduce or planning to sue the restaurant. She called me pathetic and told me to leave before I embarrassed myself further. The collective intake of breath from the surrounding diners was audible. Even those who hadn't heard the entire confrontation were beginning to understand the depth of Victoria's cruelty. "And when I refused to leave," Amara continued, her voice never wavering, "when I told her I had every right to be here, she became furious. She started screaming about how dare I speak to her that way, about knowing my place, and then she hit me." The simple, unadorned recounting of events seemed to have more impact than any dramatic flourish could have achieved. The facts spoke for themselves, laying bare the ugliness of Victoria's actions in stark, undeniable terms. Julian moved closer to his wife, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "What my wife isn't telling you," he said, his voice carrying easily through the restaurant, "is that this kind of treatment isn't new to her. She's faced this kind of prejudice and these kinds of assumptions her entire life." Amara looked up at her husband in surprise. They had talked about her past, of course, but Julian had never spoken about it publicly before. She could see something shifting in his expression, a decision being made. "My wife grew up on the south side of Chicago," Julian said, his voice filled with a pride and love that stood in stark contrast to the fury still simmering beneath the surface. Her mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table after her father died when Amara was just 8 years old. Amara herself has worked since the time she was 14, helping to support her family while maintaining straight A's in school. Victoria's sobbing had quieted slightly as she listened, perhaps beginning to understand the true magnitude of her misjudgment. "She put herself through the University of Chicago," Julian continued, "working nights as a waitress and weekends at a laundromat. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in education and dedicated her life to helping underprivileged children learn to read. When I met her 3 years ago, she was making $28,000 a year and donating half of her vacation time to volunteer literacy programs." The picture Julian was painting stood in such sharp, brutal contrast to Victoria's accusations that several diners were shaking their heads in disgust. The woman Victoria had dismissed as a gold digger and a con artist was being revealed as someone who had dedicated her life to service and education. "She has never asked me for a single thing," Julian said, his voice growing softer but no less intense. "When I proposed, she insisted on keeping her job for 6 months because she didn't want to abandon her students mid-semester. When we married, she donated her entire wardrobe to a women's shelter because she said other people needed the clothes more than she did." Amara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had fought back earlier. These were tears of love and gratitude for a husband who saw her so clearly, who understood her so completely. "The dress she's wearing tonight," Julian gestured toward Amara's simple emerald outfit. "She chose it specifically because she wanted to be comfortable, because she doesn't believe in wasting money on expensive clothes when that money could be used to help people who actually need it. She has a closet full of designer gowns that I've bought for her, but she prefers to dress like the woman I fell in love with. The woman who would rather spend $1,000 feeding hungry families than buying a handbag." Victoria's legs finally gave out completely, and she sank into the chair she had been gripping. Her perfect facade had completely crumbled, leaving behind a broken woman who was beginning to understand the true cost of her actions. "Mrs. Sterling," Julian said, turning his full attention back to Victoria, "you judged my wife based on her skin color and her clothes. You decided that because she didn't look wealthy enough for your standards, she didn't deserve basic human respect. You assaulted her because you thought she was powerless to fight back." "I'm sorry," Victoria whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I never meant. I didn't know." "You didn't know that she was married to someone who could destroy you?" Julian asked coldly. "Or you didn't know that she was a human being who deserved better treatment, regardless of her circumstances?" The distinction was brutal in its clarity, and Victoria seemed to realize that any answer she gave would only make things worse for her. 3 years ago, Julian continued, his voice taking on a different, more reflective tone. I was sitting in a coffee shop in Greenwich Village, burned out from work and questioning whether anything I was building actually mattered. I overheard a conversation between my wife and a barista about literacy rates in low-income communities. Amara was so passionate, so knowledgeable, so completely and utterly committed to making a difference that I found myself eavesdropping. A small, fond smile played at the corners of Julian's mouth as he recalled the memory. She was wearing a $20 dress from a thrift store and shoes that had clearly been resold multiple times. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was real in a way I had never encountered before. When I finally worked up the courage to introduce myself, she spent 20 minutes talking about her students before she even asked what I did for a living. The love in Julian's voice was unmistakable, and Amara felt her heart swelling with emotion. Even in the midst of this ugly confrontation, he was telling their love story. When she found out I was worth more money than she could possibly imagine, Julian continued, her first question wasn't about my house or my cars or my lifestyle. She asked if I would consider funding a new literacy program for at-risk children. She cared more about my potential to help others than my ability to provide for her. Victoria was crying openly now, her hands covering her face as the full weight of her mistake crashed down on her. Around them, diners were wiping away tears of their own, moved by the story of genuine love and partnership that Julian was sharing. "That," Julian said, his voice hardening again as he looked directly at Victoria, "is the woman you just assaulted. That is the person you decided wasn't worthy of respect. And now you are going to learn what happens when someone attacks my family." The promise of consequences hung in the air like gathering storm clouds, and Victoria Sterling was about to discover that her nightmare was only just beginning.